something happening here. But what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware.
Good evening. Welcome to Occupy TV. My name is Fergus McLean. I'm a relative latecomer to Occupy Eugene. I'm active with the Visioning Committee. Welcome to tonight's discussion of the topsy-turvy Alice in Wonderland world of corporate personhood, where we're all supposed to believe that our founders fought a war with the British Empire to give ExxonMobil the right to spend as much money as they liked to influence our elections. We're joined tonight by members of We the People Eugene, a local grassroots nonprofit group dedicated to getting corporate money out of politics and reversing the effect of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. Stan Taylor is a licensed attorney and active with Progressive Response, arm of CALC. He is director of the Lane Peace Center at Lane Community College. He teaches political science at Lane. And every year, the Lane Peace Center does a signature symposium in the spring. Stan, perhaps you'd like to tell us what that's going to be.
This year we're going to do our symposium on issues of radical democracy and economics, and we're bringing in Ben Mansky from the Liberty Tree Foundation for Radical Democracy. We're also bringing in George Friday, who is one of the co-founders for United Peace for Peace and Justice, and her specialty is building multiracial social movements. We're also bringing in David Cobb, one of the co-founders of Move to Amend, the organization that has proposed one of the constitutional amendments to end corporate personhood that we'll be discussing tonight. And we'll also be bringing in David West, who is the director of a Native American Indian Studies program at Southern Oregon University, to talk about the impacts of corporate actions on Native Americans.
And when is that?
That's going to be April 20th and 21st at Lane Community College main campus.
All right, mark your calendars. Charlie Swanson is also a professor at Lane Community College. He has his doctorate in physics from the University of Oregon and teaches mathematics and physics, and he's a member of the Lane County Democratic Central Committee. John Flannery is a longtime member of Occupy Eugene. For the Occupy members will remember that John has facilitated some of the more rowdy Occupy Eugene meetings, and he's still with the organization, which is saying a lot about John. Tonight, we'd like to cover three general areas. One, to put the issue of corporate personhood in historical context, and we'll rely on Stan to do that. And then we'd like to talk about the measure that We the People Eugene has brought to the Eugene City Council, asking the council to pass a resolution opposing corporate personhood. And last, we'd like to cover the bills that have been recently introduced in Congress to deal with issues of corporate political lobbying and spending and corporate personhood. So it's a dangerous time in America. Last year of 2011, the President signed away our Bill of Rights in the National Defense Authorization Act, which passed the Senate by a vote of 93-7. We can be proud that both Oregon senators opposed that measure. At the time when Congress is taking away civil rights from people, the Supreme Court has been awarding rights to corporations, which brings us to tonight's topic of corporate personhood. And although this situation is very frightening and shocking, it really shouldn't come as that much of a surprise. In fact, Thomas Jefferson would not be that uncomfortable with the topic tonight. When Stan gets to the historical timeline, maybe he could point out the efforts that Jefferson made to rein in corporations at the very founding of our republic. Now, while the Supreme Court and Congress have been taking away our civil liberties, in other jurisdictions around the country, different things have been happening. Charlie, can you fill us in?
There have been jurisdictions that have passed resolutions to call upon Congress to pass an amendment to take away the rights, the constitutional rights that corporations have. For example, Madison was a very early town that passed a resolution calling for such an amendment. Boulder has passed such a resolution. Missoula has also passed one. More recently, Los Angeles and New York have passed resolutions. And such resolutions are also under consideration in Portland and in Eugene.
So the two largest cities in the country. And what about that Montana Supreme Court decision?
So very recently, the Montana Supreme Court upheld the Montana prohibitions on corporate funding of elections in Montana. This was a law that was passed in 1912, and they used the language of Citizens United to argue that Montana had a compelling interest to rein in corporate spending in their state. And so they could take away the First Amendment rights that the Supreme Court says the constitutions have because they had a compelling interest to do so.
So that's a promising development at the state level, that there is a backlash to Citizens United underway, and you guys are part of that here. Stan, would you like to get us going on the history of corporate personhood?
Sure. What we have in front of us is a timeline of corporate personhood and the rights and powers of personhood, both corporate and natural. One of the things that we should recognize is that there really have been two revolutions in this country. The first revolution was embodied in the Articles of Confederation, and it was more of a radical revolution than the second one, which was the actual Constitution that was written and adopted in 1789. The first Articles of Confederation, under that, the governments under the states were organized in ways that were radically democratic. And the result was that people were petitioning their state governments to deal with the issues of debt that they had already accrued and that they wanted relieved. And what was happening is states were passing what were called leveling laws to level wealth between the rich and the poor in their states. And as those states passed laws that began to level the wealth between the rich and the poor in their states, the propertied interests, those gentleman classes, began to worry about what was happening, and hence they put into place the United States Constitution in 1789. And if you look at the Constitution, it's a document that's designed specifically to protect property. Its primarily concern is to protect property, and so what they did is they divided the form of government into a form of government that would only have one directly elected body, which was the House of Representatives, and have three other checks on that House of Representatives: the Senate, which was a gentleman's body, the President, which was separately elected through the Electoral College, not by the people, and of course the Supreme Court. And so what that meant is that the original Constitution is set up in a way to protect property, which included in those days slaves, and to limit the rights of natural persons to be able to engage in democracy. What began to happen immediately thereafter is corporations began to push their rights under the Constitution. And it's interesting to note that originally there is no mention of corporations in the original Constitution at all. In fact, originally in the 13 states there was a heavy suspicion of corporations. And of course that's because all 13 of the original colonies were founded as corporations by the king. And as they were founded by corporations by the king to promote the rights of shareholders, including the king, what was happening in those colonies is that they were being told that they didn't have the right to govern themselves, but rather they were being managed by the corporation for the benefit of shareholders. That led to the Revolution, which led to the Articles of Confederation, which led to leveling laws, which then led to the U.S. Constitution that began to seek to protect the rights of property at the expense of people. And so what you begin to see is very early on, in 1819, for example, they moved towards recognizing corporations. And this is the case of Dartmouth College versus Woodward. And basically what was happening is the Dartmouth College Board of Directors were seeking to move the college, the college itself, the state was seeking to move the college to be a college that was open to all people. And the Board of Directors from Dartmouth College didn't want that to happen. And so what the Supreme Court ruled was that the contract, or that there was a contract between the corporation and the that there was a contract that existed between the Board of Directors of the college and the state. And therefore the state could not regulate the college, because to do so would be an interference with that contract.
Stan, it's interesting to note that the contract was actually made before our country came into existence. It was actually with the king.
That's right.
And so the Constitution then protected contractual rights that occurred before our country started.
It protected the king's property.
Protected the king's property, yeah.
That's correct. But the important thing to note here is that they recognized the existence of the corporation as a person for purposes of this contract. In other words, for the first time, what we're getting is this idea that a corporation is a person with some type of protection involved in the framework.
Yeah, so another interesting thing I think that maybe we should mention is how worried some of our founding fathers were about corporate influence, especially Jefferson, and the fact that our revolution was essentially fought against a major corporation, or several corporations, but primarily against the British East India Company, which was the most powerful global corporation of its time. And so really the revolution was directly fought against a corporation.
Yeah, which I think many people don't recognize or know, that we were actually fighting a revolution to get rid of corporate rule in this country from the beginning.
And so it's as if the fight has never stopped.
I think that's right. I mean, that's why Jefferson called the Constitution that we now have a second revolution, in essence a counter-revolution against the first revolution that was fought. So what we have then is a period of time moving forward where corporations are seeking to get their rights recognized, but where many of the states, in fact all the states, had a healthy suspicion of corporations. And because they had a healthy suspicion of corporations, the original laws that dealt with the incorporation of corporations, that is the chartering of corporations, were laws that gave corporations very narrow rights. In all of the original 13 states, a corporation could only get a charter if it was operating for a public purpose, something like building a road or a dam. It would only get a charter for a limited period of time, not more than 20 to 30 years. And when the public purpose had ended, they would be unchartered and go out of existence. And if they didn't operate in the public interest, they could have their charter revoked and also go out of existence. So when you look at the early history of corporations in this country, there was a healthy suspicion of corporations because of the early history that we were talking about earlier. And so in the early days of our history, from the time that the Constitution was written forward, the power of the states was the power to control the corporations, and they did that in a very circumspect way. But if we move forward in time, what we see is that corporations are pushing forward to try to gain rights. And the real case that begins to really change this took place in 1886, which is the Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railway case. And this is a case that sought to have the 14th Amendment equal protection and due process clauses applied to corporations. In essence, corporations were asking to be ruled to be legal, fictitious legal persons for purposes of the protection of the 14th Amendment. Now this is, of course, incredibly ironic because the original 14th Amendment is, of course, part of the amendments that were the civil rights amendments that ended slavery with the 13th Amendment that provided equal protection and due process of law to the states under the 14th Amendment, and then the 15th Amendment giving the rights to vote. So the 14th Amendment was intended to make sure that newly freed slaves had equal protection under state law and were given due process under state law. But instead what's happening with the Santa Clara case is the argument that corporations are persons and that states cannot tax corporations differently than they could ordinary citizens, hence a alleged violation of equal protection of the law. Under this case, which actually was not decided on these grounds, but where the court reporter said in the headnotes that this was a case where they were recognizing the rights of corporations as legal fictitious persons, what you see right from the beginning is this is a case where if the rights of corporations are said to be persons, what's happening is states are losing their right to regulate. And so from the beginning, as soon as you begin to talk about corporations having rights as persons, what you're saying is states have less ability to regulate corporations under their legal framework, under their constitutions.
And Stan, so these rights they were claiming equal rights not with other corporations, but equal rights with people themselves, with natural persons.
That's right. If you look at that original case, what was happening is that the property of the railroads was being taxed at a different rate than properties of ordinary individuals. And the corporations argued that this was a violation of equal protection of the law since they were being treated differently in their taxing process than natural persons were.
So another interesting thing that comes up with this is, so far none of the things that you have said that were giving excess, what I would say are excess rights to corporations, involved elected bodies doing this. This was the Supreme Court giving these rights. So it wasn't people electing, it wasn't our Congress giving these rights, it was the Supreme Court doing it on their own, by an appointed body.
That's absolutely right, and there's a lot of irony to that, of course, because conservatives often argue that the Supreme Court should be one that only talks about original intent and that it shouldn't be an activist court. But what you can see is from very early on, the Supreme Court as a conservative body was an activist court reinterpreting the Constitution in very dramatic ways that are detrimental to natural persons.
I think it's only fair to point out that New Jersey and Delaware helped this process too by creating extremely lax expectations of for corporations that incorporated in those states. That was definitely a new trend, that before the states had actually tried to regulate corporations, and then there was this trend beginning then that they would rather just have them incorporate and pay a fee and you can do anything you want.
And that was kind of the beginning of some of the things that we see now, where the state can make more money if they get the corporation to come there. And now, for example, cities are giving excess tax breaks to a corporation to come to their city rather than be in somebody else's city. So that process of
the race to the bottom.
The race to the bottom is continuing.
Mm-hmm. When did that process start? The loosening of state regulations over corporations?
Started in the early 1800s. As John was talking about, both Delaware and New Jersey were the first of the states. I think it was in the 1830s.
I thought it was the middle 1800s, but yeah.
I think it was in the 1830s
Okay.
that Delaware was the first, and then New Jersey to follow began that loosening process. And that process picked up as the transcontinental railroads went across the United States. What was happening with the transcontinental railroads as they went across the United States was that they were given large land grants, and as they got large land grants, they used that to engage in real estate development. And they made huge amounts of money as they went across, and then they used that money to influence state legislatures to loosen regulations on corporations.
So corporate welfare started pretty early in this country then, much earlier than welfare for people.
I think I read that the total land grants awarded to railroads is equal to the size of the states of Texas and Virginia.
Wow.
So, the Nelsons and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies all got very rich in that process. Sometimes they're referred to as the robber barons. And they, among others, put heavy pressure on states to basically get rid of any kind of limitations on the ability of corporations to engage in business. And so by the time that the Santa Clara County case was decided, all states allowed corporations to engage in any legal business for unlimited periods of time and granted them limited liability in terms of the shareholders that are involved, the owners who are involved. And so when Lincoln was president, he warned against the fact that corporations were being enshrined in this country and that it would be an end to democracy and our ability to actually have a true democracy in this country.
It's only fair to point out that Lincoln was a railroad lawyer himself.
It's true, although it's also interesting to note that Lincoln had several members of the revolutionary members of European revolutions that became part of his administration as well. It's interesting to note that in the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, which were radical socialist revolutions, that they were unsuccessful, and many of those revolutionaries then immigrated to what we think of as the Midwest today, to Wisconsin and Illinois, and they had an influence on Lincoln and his thinking, which is why Lincoln believed that labor was independent of capital, not subject to it. So there's some very interesting history with Lincoln himself and exactly where he stood on these issues, but definitely he understood that capital, particularly corporate capital, should not be the box that labor was put into as a means for disempowering labor, really. So if you return to this timeline, it's quite ironic, as I said earlier, that Santa Clara County, that corporations are given the rights of persons in the 14th Amendment, and when you begin to look then at 14th Amendment cases, equal protection cases, what you see is that there are hundreds of equal protection cases brought by corporations over the next 2 decades, where only two dozen or so cases are brought by persons who were former slaves to get equal protection rights under the Constitution. So very quickly what you see is that corporations are using equal protection at a much higher rate than it was intended for, than the original newly freed slaves are using it.
Corporations probably had more money to spend on lawyers than the former slaves did, so that might account for a lot of that.
It does, and it's also worth noting that when you look at that period of time, that in the early 1870s, the Republican Congress passed civil rights laws that were very similar to our current 1965 civil rights law, and that those were struck down by the Supreme Court in the late 1870s, where the Supreme Court said the 14th Amendment only gives states the right to, or prohibits states from discriminating, that it doesn't prevent individuals from discriminating one against another. And so by the end of the 1880s, the Supreme Court had ruled that individuals, like you and I, can discriminate based upon race, and that there is nothing in the Constitution that prohibits that. And then if you move forward to 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson case, the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities meet the requirements of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, which then gives states the right to discriminate based upon race. And so by 1896, essentially the gains that had been put into place from the Civil War freeing slaves had been turned back, where individuals could discriminate based upon race and states could discriminate based upon race as well.
So by that time, the main beneficiaries of the 14th Amendment were the corporations, and not people.
That's right. That's right. And if you move forward in this timeline, what you'll see is a series of cases that provide to the corporation new and different constitutional rights beyond the 14th Amendment. So over time, the corporations get the right to the Fifth Amendment against takings from corporations. One of the cases that's here talks about how Pennsylvania could not regulate the corporations from mining. When corporations had been given mining rights to minerals under the ground, they were actually digging tunnels that caused the buildings on top of the ground to collapse. And of course, those who owned the buildings sued for the loss of the buildings that they were having, and the Supreme Court ruled that the states could not regulate the corporations in terms of the mining rights, because to do so would be a taking of their property under the Fifth Amendment.
Kind of like the fracking that's going on now, and where buildings are collapsing because of the fracking going on underneath towns. So it hasn't changed that much.
Hasn't changed that much. And of course, there are provisions in free trade agreements like the NAFTA agreement that provide that when a state regulates a corporation, if it stops the corporation from making profits it would have made, that this is a type of expropriation of future profits, and the corporations have the right to recover for what they would have made but for the regulation being put into place. So this framework is being extended to the global framework in terms of global trade as well.
So Stan, all I need to do is come up with rationale of how I could have become rich, and I can sue on this basis. Is that right? Or do I need to incorporate first?
You probably need to incorporate first, and you probably need to have a business in place that is impacted by the regulation. But nonetheless, you can really think about any kind of regulation. I mean, one of the cases that was most prominent was a case in California where they regulated a gas additive called MTBE. And what they had discovered is this additive was cancer causing. And so the state regulated it, and the company that produced it, Methanex Corporation, they sued the United States for almost $1 billion. And while they didn't prevail in this case, the pattern has been that in these types of cases that they have generally prevailed. And so anytime a state wants to engage in regulation, they have to calculate whether they can afford the potential future profits that may be lost by a corporation if this regulation somehow stops them from doing what they've previously been doing, even though what they've previously been doing is very harmful to people and the environment.
So the Supreme Court doesn't seem to have taken the part of the Constitution that says promote the general welfare in the very beginning of the Constitution very seriously, at least as far as people go.
Yeah, I think that's the very unexplored area of the Constitution, and hopefully one that will begin to be used more often.
So Stan, could you maybe go on to some of the more recent cases that have gotten a lot of attention?
Particularly the Commerce Clause.
Well, I was thinking of the more recent cases relating to
elections.
Let me move forward to Buckley versus Vallejo. This is a 1976 case, and this is the first case that the Supreme Court, well, it's not the first case, but it's the first prominent case the Supreme Court ruled that spending money for political purposes is the equivalent of free speech. And this case is significant because it's already dealing with the first campaign finance reform law that was passed in the early 1970s, where Nixon was actually getting huge amounts of money brought into him using paper bags that were full of unmarked bills. And so Congress passed a campaign finance reform act in the early 1970s, which was challenged under Buckley versus Vallejo. And this is the first time that they're saying when independent expenditures are made for political purposes to influence elections, that this is equivalent to free speech and that the government cannot regulate that independent expenditures for political purposes because spending money for political purposes is the equivalent of free speech. So that's the precursor to the
It may be very
Citizens United.
expensive free speech, but free nonetheless.
Free nonetheless. In essence, what they're saying is if you have a ability to have a large megaphone, then that's your right to use that large megaphone. And for the rest of us that only have the ability to stand on a soapbox, well, that's fine. It's all free speech. And because it's all free speech, it's all protected under the First Amendment. Now, one of the things I think that's important to remember here is it's not just the ability to speak loudly, but it's because they're recognizing corporations as persons that this combination is what creates a new ability to speak that is far in excess of anything that an ordinary natural person can do, and is a real sea change in the framework for how we understand, elections and democracy.
And they're giving the rights of management to make the decision for the people, the shareholders who actually own the corporation. They don't have the right to actually decide what political speech they want, except to the effect that they can perhaps change the management.
Well, that's one of the things that the most recent case that most people have heard about, Citizens United versus Federal Elections Commission, did, is that prior to that decision, corporations could not spend money directly out of their general funds on elections. So you had political action committees being formed and employees and others contributing to political actions committees, which were then spending funds on elections. But with the Citizens United decision, corporations can now spend money directly out of their general funds, unlimited amounts for political purposes, and it creates the irony that shareholders who own that stock may have the corporation spending money for political purposes for points of view that they don't support as shareholders.
Stan, am I correct in believing that not only United States corporations, but foreign corporations are also protected under the Citizens United ruling?
That's also true, which I think is a very interesting framework because foreign people, generally speaking, are prohibited by law from contributing directly to political campaigns. So if I were a foreign citizen and wanted to contribute to Obama's campaign in the next election, there are laws that would prevent me from doing that. But if I'm a foreign corporation, if I'm a corporation here that has shareholders that are foreign owners, those shareholders are essentially influencing the outcome of the elections here because corporate contributions can't be limited.
So they are United States corporations with foreign owners, but they're not non-United States corporations.
That's correct.
I see.
Whatever the difference is.
Yeah,
Right.
most corporations of that size are global corporations at this point. Anyway.
Wherever they have
Yeah.
their corporate registration.
Yes.
They're not loyalty is not exactly part of their charter. In fact, if it gets in the way of profits, they're legally obligated to ignore loyalty.
In fact, that's another one of these decisions that's up here on the board. In 1919, the Dodge versus Ford Motor Company case is a case in which the Supreme Court ruled that the fiduciary obligation of the managers of a corporation was to maximize profits to their shareholders. So in 1919, the Supreme Court basically ruled that a corporation has to, by law, those who are managing have to maximize profits to their shareholders, which means other types of concerns, environmental and consumer. If you're managing your corporation to maximize those, you're actually breaching your fiduciary duty to maximize profit.
So I think maybe at this time we should think a little bit more about the Citizens United and talk about the fact that because of that decision, a group of us in Eugene came together and formed a new organization which is called We the People Eugene. And this group, it was really formed in response to Citizens United decision that to challenge corporate rule, mostly to challenge the corporate rule that comes from their political power, but in some extent to challenge that which comes from their economic power, which are intimately connected at this point. So one of the first things that we started doing is collecting signatures to convince the City Council to pass a resolution calling for an amendment to overturn the effects of Citizens United. And we very quickly came to the notion that we wanted to broaden that scope and not just overturn Citizens United, but to overturn the whole notion of corporate personhood, which Stan presented a little information about. So
now I have a little tendency to get lost in the details here, but bear with us. It's a complicated topic, but perhaps do you have a copy of our resolution?
I do. So the resolution, it's relatively long, but I'll read the whole resolution. And this is what we have presented to the City Council, and we're hoping that they will pass such a thing. Whereas business corporations were created as artificial entities that were subordinate to our democracy, and corporations are not mentioned in the United States Constitution, and are required by the Supreme Court decisions to put profit ahead of any other concern, and influence and interfere with democratic processes, and use advertising and ownership of the media to substitute corporate values for community and family values, and whereas political opinions are inalienable and stockholders do not and may not assign their political viewpoints to corporate management, and a Washington Post ABC News poll found that 80% of Americans oppose the Citizens United ruling, Democrats 85%, Republicans 76%, Independents 81%, and a Harris poll found that 87% think big companies have too much influence in Washington, and the original Boston Tea Party was an action of civil disobedience against tax cuts for the largest multinational corporation, and polls suggest that a majority of Americans favor single-payer health insurance, but excessive corporate influence over our political process and our media have thwarted the will of the people so much that Congress has not seriously considered a single-payer system, and 70% to 80% of Americans in recent years have supported increasing tax rates on the wealthy, but undue corporate influence has again made Congress thwart the will of the people, and climate change threatens human civilizations, but preventative action threatens corporate profits, and profit is proving more powerful than human need. Therefore, be it hereby resolved that the City of Eugene calls for reclaiming democracy from the corrupting effects of undue corporate influence by amending the U.S. Constitution to establish that corporations are not entitled to constitutional rights granted to persons. Therefore, regulating corporate political speech and spending is not equivalent to limiting political speech. Be it further resolved that the City Council of Eugene does hereby direct the City Clerk to send a copy of this resolution to state legislators representing Eugene, to the Oregon Congressional Delegation representing Eugene, and to all other cities in the state of Oregon. So that's what we would like to have passed by the City Council.
And hopefully some city councilors will be able to watch this program.
It's also worth noting that we gathered over 5,000 signatures on a petition supporting this resolution.
So that's been a big part of our effort over the past year, is gathering those signatures to show that there is lots of support for this. And there.
By the way, the Occupy Eugene General Assembly endorsed the We the People petition.
Okay. And some of our local representatives have signed our petition. In fact, Phil Barnhart signed it on camera. So there is support from some of our local politicians.
Charlie, I know you and John and Stan are planning a forum to discuss language for a constitutional amendment, and in recent months, a number of proposals for a constitutional amendment have come before Congress. Would you like to review those for us?
Yeah, so this is a national issue at this point. I mean, there's been at least 6 bills introduced in Congress which are amendments that relate to this issue. Some of them are just simply overturning the effect of Citizens United, of the Citizens United decision. Donna Edwards, a representative from Maryland, probably had the first proposed amendment doing such a thing. Her bill, or her amendment to the U.S. Constitution, would simply disallow corporations from contributing to political campaigns. After that, a number of other amendments have been proposed. Kurt Schrader from Oregon proposed another one, which would allow states and the federal government to control donations and expenditures in political campaigns. Senator Udall and Merkley of Oregon, with a few other senators, also introduced a bill in the Senate, an amendment which would do very similar things, would allow Congress to control the spending for elections.
But does not directly address corporate personhood.
But none of those three directly address corporate personhood. Jim McGovern introduced an amendment which does prohibit or abolish corporate personhood, or basically abolishes corporate constitutional rights, is what I really should say. It directly says that the word person or people does not include corporations when it's used in the Constitution.
And we have discussed in We the People trying to amend the Oregon Constitution. If we were to do that, it would probably be similar language to that, simply to say that in Oregon, corporations are not considered persons.
Yeah, or when the word persons or people is used in the Constitution, it is not intended to give those rights, those constitutional rights of natural persons to corporations. The legislator certainly could give those rights to corporations, but that would be up to the legislature to decide if they wanted to give those rights. It's not a constitutional right that's inherent in them. I mean, our Constitution recognizes many of the rights, say the Bill of Rights, as inherent in the people. The Constitution didn't give them, it just recognized that those were rights that people had because they were people. So McGovern's amendment does abolish corporate personhood, or abolish corporate constitutional rights. Another amendment that was introduced by Representative Ted Deutsch of Florida, and has more recently been introduced in the Senate by Bernie Sanders, not only abolishes corporate personhood, but also prohibits corporations from making donations or expenditures for political campaigns.
Entirely.
Entirely. So it prohibits that practice for nonprofit, or for-profit corporations are prohibited. Nonprofits are not affected by the Deutsch and Sanders amendment.
And the Deutsch-Sanders amendment, that's the one that's called the Occupy amendment.
Yeah, it's called Occupied.
Occupied?
Yes, and I don't remember the exact words that Occupied stands for, but it's worth looking at. The most recent one that I am aware of is one by John Yarmouth, of a Democrat from Kentucky, and Walter Jones, and a Republican from North Carolina. So actually a Republican is getting into the picture of introducing amendments. This one would address the free speech issue and say that financial expenditures for a candidate for federal office are not protected free speech. So it's directly what it says. And Congress shall have the power and is allowed to enact a public financing system. It also does an interesting thing, which is in some sense not related, but is related to democracy, and that's it sets forth a legal public holiday for voting.
Yeah, seems like a
So
idea.
these are all amendments that have been introduced in Congress at this session. So there's certainly a lot of thought going into the notion that these things need to be addressed.
It's interesting to note that they feel the need to defend the right to create a public financing system. I know that recently the Supreme Court ruled certain parts of Arizona's public financing unconstitutional because it would have hurt the rights of people who weren't getting that public financing. In other words, they were saying that the speech that was being paid for by the state was somehow unconstitutional speech but if it was paid by rich people, it would be fully constitutional.
Yeah.
I think the point of this is that a lot of these rules are being made up not really truly based on first principles. They're being made up by looking at who benefits and who doesn't and coming up with a rationale to justify them.
And the beneficiaries that the Supreme Court is looking for at this point would be the very rich or the corporations, the 1%, or probably the
1% of
1% of the 1%, really.
Sorry, Stan, go ahead.
Well, it's ironic because the Arizona law was put into place in response to the Buckley versus Vallejo Supreme Court case that declared money is speech. And so since they weren't able to directly limit the contributions, independent contributions or expenditures after Buckley versus Vallejo, what they decided to do was to set up a mechanism to try to deal with the limitations that Buckley put into place. And so what they did was they set up a system where if you were a candidate that chose to be financed through public campaign contributions, that you'd make that option and there'd be a certain amount of money that you would be entitled to as a public candidate. But if you chose to get money from private sources, you could raise as much as you wanted. But the way that they tried to deal with this idea that there could be private candidates that raise far more money than public candidates was that after that limit was reached, if there was additional money that was raised by the private candidates, it would be matched for the public candidates as well. So it would end the incentive to engage in private financing. And what they've done in Bennett basically is say that the public financing winds up burdening an undue burden on the private finance candidates, and therefore is a burden on their free speech, and therefore is being struck down.
And so it's essentially recognizing, I think that as John has pointed out, that the Supreme Court is recognizing the competitive nature of speech in a political process, that those who speak more often win. And it refused to recognize that notion in the Citizens United because there the advantage was given to the corporations, whereas in the Arizona case, the advantage, or at least the lack of advantage, I guess, was there was a lack of an advantage to the ultra-wealthy, or the advantage maybe in some sense was given to the public. It really wasn't an advantage, but it was a lack of advantage to the extremely wealthy. So the Supreme Court has recognized that competitive nature of speech in the more recent Arizona Free Speech Club versus Bennett, but did not acknowledge that in the Citizens United decision.
As I understand it, in all these amendments, except perhaps the occupied amendment, they only allow Congress to take action, but action is not mandated. Is that an issue?
Yeah. So that's pretty much true. I mean, some of them, McGovern's, for example, does abolish corporate personhood, but it does not prohibit corporate spending in elections. It would allow Congress to do so.
To regulate.
To regulate it, or to prohibit it. Congress could prohibit it also. So yeah, there's many amendments that do so. So we're concerned with a lot of the specific language of the amendments, and we're concerned that some of them are not strong enough in protecting people's rights. And we're also interested in what these various amendments and clauses have. And also, there's a few other amendments that I should say have been proposed. Move to amend has one nationally proposed that does a lot of things similar to Deutsch and Sanders, but has a few differences. And we've been working on some language that we think is useful that does a few different things. So we're putting together a public conversation related to these issues. And John, do you want to maybe say more about that?
Yeah, as Charlie, as you're saying, a lot of the constitutional amendments out there now are both flawed in that there's things that they don't cover, as well as things that they may do too much. I think we all have concerns about where it says, for instance, maybe the tightest one, that the Deutsch and Sanders one says that none of this is going to limit freedom of the press, which sounds very good, but what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that if ExxonMobil buys a printing press, then anything that they want to do with it is corporate free speech? And if it's ExxonMobil, they can probably buy a printing press the size of NBC or some other major network, and that's freedom of the press, and we can't do anything about it.
Okay, we're winding down our time now, and I think that illustrates that this is a long and complicated conversation, and that these fellows have been putting together a very high-level panel that will happen at the University of Law School.
University of Oregon Law School, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's Wednesday the 18th. It's
January 18th.
Right. And
At
7 o'clock at room 175.
Before we go any further, Stan, could we step back for a moment and just how is it that the Constitution can be amended?
Well, there are two ways. One is for Congress itself to propose amendments, which we are hearing is being done at this point. And once the Congress has adopted the amendment, to send it out for the states for ratification, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify that amendment for it to become a law.
Both houses of the state legislatures would have to approve, and signed by the governor, I assume.
It's a state ratification process, so yes. And then the second one is through a constitutional convention, where the states themselves can call for a constitutional convention, and if a constitutional convention is called, then the drafting of amendments is wide open at that point. In fact, the constitutional convention would be something that could modify the entire Constitution or rewrite the entire Constitution. If the Constitutional Convention was convened appropriately and amendments came out of that convention, then it would go back to Congress and then back to the states for ratification.
I don't think it would go back to Congress. I think it's just 3/4 of the states
You're
would
right.
ratify at that
That's
point.
correct,
So there's still the 3/4 of the states have to ratify it if it comes from a constitutional convention.
That's correct.
So the difference is does it come from a constitutional convention or does it come from Congress?
So it's ultimately up to the states, and since our two senators were the only two senators who voted against the
No, there's
abrogation,
7 of them.
but the only state with both senators opposing the National Defense Authorization Act. Oregon is in a leadership position in these issues.
So to say a little bit more about the amendment language discussion that we have, so what are we titling that discussion, and who's going to be there?
Amending the Constitution in response to Citizens United, pitfalls and possibilities. Again, it's about the dangers as well as the opportunities and what productive areas might be for a constitutional amendment. Stan is going to be on the panel, as well as John Davidson from the University of Oregon's Political Science Department, and Dave Fidenki, who's the Executive Director of ACLU of Oregon. And we are looking primarily for these people's guidance as far as what not to do. And is if we want to draft model language, which we're going to ask our representatives to support, we don't want to screw it up. It's the First Amendment, and it's a big deal.
Yeah. And so we also are putting on another event related to this, which is in conjunction with the National Move to Amend movement called Occupy the Courts.
January 20th at the new federal courthouse begins at noon. We'll have a labor speaker during the noon hour, so hopefully some of the union folks can join us. But it will go all afternoon. Stan will be speaking there. John Davidson also will be speaking there, and Gordon Lafer from the Labor Education and Research Center at the University of Oregon. And there will be cookies and hot chocolate and lots of entertainment, and I hope you can join us.
There'll be street theater,
Right.
and hopefully some music.
It'll be a great time to come out and show the Eugene City Council that there is a lot of support for taking action, as the cities of Los Angeles, New York, Boulder, Missoula, and others have done. Final thoughts. We the people, you have a open house, February 12th, I think.
Yeah, we have a February 12th open house. We welcome people. It's going to be at the McNeil Riley House on Sunday at 1:30 to kind of welcome people to our organization. Tell them a little bit about us.
Thank you for joining us.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that?